here this evening. I wanted to note a couple of additional agenda items that were put on the agenda late in the week. Just to point out to folks that number 7 this evening, the resolution supporting the county's ambulance reimbursement fee, was added late in the week. The 9th agenda item, the discussion of the State Highway Administration proposal regarding Ethan Allen and Flower, was also added late in the week. And the first work session item, item 8, which is the comments on the task force on the environmental action report and council discussion of the recommendations of the task force. This evening's discussion is the first of a number of weeks of discussion, and the first additional discussion on that will be next week. So we know we're not going to get anywhere near through that discussion this evening. And then my final comment is that I moved the council comments section to the end of the meeting so that we can dive right into some of our stuff early this evening. So we'll go right to public comment. And if anybody has any public comment that you'd like to make on any item that is not on our regular meeting agenda, so anything on any discussion on items 1 through 7, please hold for those items. Anything for the work session discussion or anything not on our agenda, this is the appropriate time. So if anybody wants to make any comments on the Task Force on Environmental Action Report, now is the time. And if you would identify yourself and keep your comments to 3 minutes, we'd appreciate it. Go ahead.
John, do you want to help Pat?
Oh. Okay, my name is Pat Lovelace, 7620 Maple Avenue, Tacoma Park, Maryland. And I want to remind everybody, oh no.
Time's up.
I want to remind everybody that we've only got 22 days for voting. Well, maybe that's the alarm of what's going to happen if people don't get up and vote and we have another turnout like our primary did. Because if us Democrats don't get on the stick, we're going to end up losing O'Malley for governor and end up losing all the gains we've gotten. And I don't know how I can stress on people the importance of voting. And also, they're the first ones to complain when nothing is getting done right. But they're the first ones who will not get out and vote. I don't know how much I can stress to the people out there and to everybody who has family, relatives, or anything, that it's their duty to get up and vote. They have to do it. It's their duty. If they care about their family and their friends and their city and their community, they should at least get up and vote. They come out in droves for the folk festivals. They come out in droves for the ball games. They come out in droves to go to the beach. But they did not come out in droves for the primary. If that's any indication of what we're up against, us Democrats are going to be in a lot of trouble. And I'm really worried about that. Also, as you know, Halloween is coming up this time. There's going to be a lot of partying going on. And I'd also like to remind people to please watch out for those little kids on the streets this coming season. And don't drink and drive, please. And also, I'd like to know if they're going to be encouraging adults to take the kids out trick-or-treating, I don't think they should be just running off alone lately, because there's been more and more weird crimes going on. And every time I hear of an abduction or something, I think I don't want to see that in my city. My health could not take that. And also, please, do what you can, everybody, all you kids out there, remind your teachers to stress the importance of voting, please. The teachers can really carry a message now. They can have a day where the kids can go home and remind their parents, did you register to vote? Are you going to vote on the 2nd? Please, do it for me. Vote. Tell the children that. Look your kids in the eyes tonight and say, I'm going to vote, and get out there and vote. Please, us Democrats, if we want to keep all the gains we have fought so hard to work for, don't let us lose them. Thanks for letting me share. Peace in Tacoma Park.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez.
All right, you too.
Anybody else like to comment?
Hi, my name is Bob Sullivan. I live at 319 Boyd Avenue in Tacoma Park, and I'm here as part of the Tacoma Foundation. It's a nonprofit group that's given away over $300,000 over the past 20 years in Tacoma Park and Tacoma Park, D.C., Tacoma, D.C., and Silver Spring. We are having on October 16th from 4 to 7 at the Katie Lee Mansion, which is 64 Eastern Avenue. You can walk there from the Tacoma Metro. There'll be lots of parking. We're having a beer tasting fundraiser. It's the second annual nuclear-free beer tasting. And at this event, and I'm going to be asking each of the city council members to come, and I'll be giving you our flyer. We are having 8 breweries are going to be presenting their wares at the Katie Lee. And actually, if you're out there and you've never been in the Katie Lee, it's your opportunity to see it. We will be giving tours of the Katie Lee. Diana Cohen, who's head of Historic Tacoma, will be there providing tours. We're having, as I say, 8 breweries. Also have local restaurants and food stores who are providing food for us, donating food, so I hope you go out and support them. That would be Whole Foods, Olive Lounge, the Tacoma, a Middle Eastern restaurant, the Tacoma Park Silver Springs Food Co-op, Roscoe's, Capital City Cheesecake, and I'll be grilling barbecue brats. That'll be first parboiled in beer. But I encourage you to come out and see that. We also have a Washington Area Music Award-winning band, Karen Collins and the Backroads Band. Karen Collins lives on Sycamore Avenue, so you can see another Tacoma Park resident. David Eisner will be providing the sound for this event. We also have Dick Spotswood from WAMU will be there, and he'll be selling a book. It's about a banjo player, so Ira Gantner, who is the amazing guitar player in the Backroads Band, will be playing some banjo. We'll also be having a beer tasting expert who has taught beer classes in China, Chris O'Brien, and he'll be there selling his book. So you can not only enjoy food, enjoy beer, enjoy music, and enjoy a venue. So I hope that everyone can come out on October 16th at the Katie Lee Mansion between 4 and 7. And it's a $35 fee. Of that, $25 is tax deductible because we're a 501c3, so you get a receipt when you pay at the door. Or you can purchase, or you can go to Olive Lounge, and Now and Then are also selling advance tickets. So I hope everybody can come out, and particularly the council members. Thank you.
Good, thanks.
We will present you.
I apologize for not being able to come this year because I have a wedding to go to in Philadelphia, but it was a wonderful event last year. I encourage people to go, and I'm actually very, very sad that I'm going to miss the event.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, same here. Unfortunately, I have a wedding to go to.
Is Pete getting married on the 16th? Don't they check with that first?
Apparently not.
I'll donate again. Thanks very much.
I could say that we gave a lot of money to this building.
Yes?
Okay. I'm here this week as Kay Daniels Cohen from Sherman Avenue to talk about some of the discussion during the council members' comments last week regarding the arrest of Corey Moore on September the 25th and the discovery of over $200,000 worth of drugs, cash, and weapons in his rented apartment on Sherman Avenue. I was shocked at this arrest, but even more shocked at the comments from my own Ward 3 council member. And I'm quoting here, "I see a tragedy with many players, including his parents, the neighborhood where he grew up, the court system, the police, the legal system, the war on drugs, Moore's peers, and of course Moore himself. I'm here to comment on the other victims and tragedies of Corey Moore that Mr. Robinson failed to mention. There was no mention in any of your stated or written remarks about our city residents who somehow were avoided serious tragedy because there were no shootouts on the street. I think the law-abiding, tax-paying constituents should be more of your concern. Ward 3 residents would appreciate knowing first and foremost that you represent them and are looking out for their best interest. Your remarks, intentional or not, give the impression that your efforts and sympathies lie with the alleged criminal, and there's been no regard for or compassion for the neighborhood. What is really tragic here is that an individual with enough brains to create an extensive drug-selling system was indicted for, but not convicted of 4 murders, among other crimes, for which he did indeed serve time, was only willing to use his brain for criminal acts and not for the good of his community. We all have choices to make every day, and he could have chosen a different path at any time during his life. He put our community in danger without regard to anyone's safety. I'm thankful that I live in a city with a police department that is willing to answer the call of the community. I'm hoping that despite Corey Moore's defense attorney's comments in the Washington Post article of yesterday, that his arrest concludes in an indictment and conviction on all charges listed. I'm commending the chief and his officers for a job well done, and I thank all of you for your time and everything you do for our city. And I have 35 seconds to spare.
And I'd like to respond, Kay, if I can.
I knew you were going to do
Yeah,
that.
well, you're my constituent and I'm your representative.
Right.
So I think I'm hearing you say that you're holding me responsible for not taking my constituents into consideration when I made the comments about it being a tragedy. And I guess I'd ask you, do you not see it as a tragedy?
What, the whole issue?
Yes, Corey Moore and his trajectory and all the violence in the people he's harmed in trajectory and all the people who are addicted to drugs because of him and
Absolutely,
and all
and
the
that
pain
was part of what I
and
was
agony
going to
that's
say.
So you do agree with me that it is a tragedy?
The whole thing is a tragedy.
Good.
but
Well, that's
he
what I
could-
wanted to know.
He could have chosen a different path any time in his life.
And
Any of
as
us
we
did.
all have many choices, I agree with you there. But I don't, I'm sad to hear you blame me for not taking my constituents into consideration, because I certainly do. So I just want to make that point
Okay.
in my own defense.
In any of your
But-
comments, Dan, in any of your comments, whether it was on last week at the city council meeting or on the internet or never did you once mention one of us. This was a very serious crime that went down, and we were very
Oh, yeah.
lucky that it ended the way that it ended, and hopefully that it will stay. It will stay in the condition that it's in right now.
I'm very glad that no one on our street was harmed, that Claire, his neighbor, had positive things to say about him in the Washington Post, because we're all complex people. But no one on our street, or none of my constituents, were harmed in any way, other than us knowing that this is a dangerous criminal, and he is dangerous, I'm sure, because he was brought up that way, and because he turned into a violent person, and whether it was his own choice or entirely, or was a matter of his own circumstance and being brought up in the environment he was brought up in, however you want to interpret it. I do believe it was a tragedy.
This is an interesting conversation,
I think,
but I
Kay,
think
that
I'd
you
like
agree,
to
because
call
you
a
just
halt
said
at this
so.
point.
So, okay,
And
thank you.
appreciate both of your comments and continue the discussion.
All right.
Thanks. Anybody else who'd like to comment? Okay, we'll move along to the city manager's comments.
None this evening.
Okay, well, then we'll move along right on time to the regular meeting and the first item, which is a second reading ordinance authorizing installation of a speed hump on the 100 block of Sherman Avenue. Would somebody like to introduce that ordinance?
I'll introduce it. Second.
Moved by Councilmember Robinson, seconded by Councilmember Siemens. Is there any council discussion? We had this at first reading already. I don't see any comments. Is there any public comment on this item? Okay, seeing none, since this is a second reading, it requires a roll call vote. Will the clerk please call a roll?
Mayor Williams?
Aye.
Councilmember Wright?
Aye.
Councilmember Clay?
She's supposed to be on the phone. I don't know what happened.
We've been having some connection
Councilmember Robinson?
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens?
Aye.
Councilmember Snipper?
Aye.
Councilmember Schultz?
Nay.
Okay, that carries 5-1. We'll move on to the next item, which is a second reading ordinance authorizing installation of a speed hump on the 200 block of Grant Avenue. Do I hear it moved?
I'll move it. Second.
Moved by Councilmember Schultz, second by Councilmember Wright. Is there any council discussion of this ordinance?
I have a quick question.
Yes?
Is this a first reading or a
Second.
second reading?
This is a second. It's
Okay,
the top of the blue sheet should read second.
thank you. I'm confused.
Any council comments on this one? Any public comments on this one? There's a public comment.
Yeah, my name is Pat Loveless, 7620 Maple Avenue, Tacoma Park, Maryland, your official peace delegate. I got a question for you, is, with all these speed bumps going in, when I go over them a lot of times, they do hurt my back. And is there any way they could make them a little more gradual in some places? Because there's a couple of really high ones in this city, I think we know, almost like climbing Mount McKinley. You know, it probably snow on top of them all year round. Second question is, does anybody know officially how many speed bumps are there in Tacoma Park? I'm just curious about that one.
I think I could safely say over 100. Beyond that, I'm not sure I could say.
Really? Safely over 100? Well, I'm just curious, because if there's any other ways we can encourage the slowing down of these speeders anyway. I know we have to do something about it, but I went over a speed bump a few days ago on the way back from a demonstration, and it hurt my back pretty good. And I was wondering if there's any way they can design them a little easier on us, with people with bad vertebrae. Thank you.
I do know that the city has standards for speed humps, and that there are still a few in the city that do not meet those standards.
Can they correct those ones that are not meeting the standards, by the way?
They've mostly been corrected, and I know among the ones that do not meet the standards are the ones on Maple Avenue.
That's right.
And those basically got a pass.
Yeah. I was wondering if they're eventually going to correct the ones on Maple Avenue or not.
Basically, only if the council decides that we want to reverse the decision that we made when those were reinstalled. Those got to go into a different standard, and I will say, as one of the people who was on the council at that time and voting on that, a number of us felt like we never wanted to have that discussion again, never wanted to have that exemption again, and it was one of the hardest votes that we ever had to continue that exemption.
Yeah, I know, but my backbone wants something done about that one.
I guess all I can suggest is maybe tell whoever's driving, go a little slower or take a different route. But
Yeah.
I agree, Maple Avenues are very tough.
Yeah, but eventually they may do something, I hope. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other public comment? This is a second reading ordinance. Will the clerk please call the roll?
You have a comment?
Oh, sorry, sorry, go ahead.
Is this working okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. I bring to you
Just identify
tonight's
yourself.
top 10 list. You know David Letterman, that whole thing, yeah. It goes like this, okay. Of things Tacoma Park can do without spending a lot of money, but rather through the strategic use of publicity, some signage, a bit of networking, and the assistance of city residents. I'm speaking, of course, to the discussion later on Task Force on Environmental Action, the comments by the staff that were made. Number 10, allow forest easements for private forests. Number 9, enact a strict anti-idling law and actually enforce it. Number 8, encourage residents to paint their roofs white, an inexpensive way to cool your home. Number 7, bulk purchase of rain barrels for resale to homeowners. I admit that one might actually require the expenditure of some dollars. In response to what Pat was saying, no more speed humps. There's no proof they make anyone safer, but there is proof that the stopping and starting necessitated by them causes more air pollution, and they can be a pain in the back. Number 5, put dog poop stations in city parks. See, I have a little thing that says show picture. I don't know, where's the camera coming from? Where are you guys coming from?
It's, yep. No, it's right here. It's right here.
That's right there? Okay. Yes, they're not that expensive. Outfall tests conducted for the city engineer show extremely high levels of Enterococcus and E. coli, signs of human and animal feces. The stations are not that expensive. Number 4, prohibit the use of gas-powered leaf blowers. They contribute to the unhealthy levels of ozone in our air. I have up-to-date figures from this summer on the levels of ozone and nitrogen oxides as measured by a monitor at Tacoma Elementary School in the district. Number 3, revise the tree ordinance so people who want to install solar panels are not penalized for doing so. Based on the recent discussion, I think that one is fairly self-explanatory. Number 2, encourage the use of clotheslines to cut down on electricity use. Simple solution, don't have to use the dryer. Number 1, most times a year. With global warming, 365 days a year. Number 1, start talking with municipalities throughout the area about how collectively we can buy our streetlights from Pepco. The more the burden of exploring this recommendation is shared, the less time it will take and the less it will cost. We really have no idea whether it will work unless we start the fact-finding process. And just one more thing on that, I noticed in the staff comments it said, untold costs, legal costs, et cetera. But it also said, this has never been tried in Maryland. To me, that is a reason for doing it, if Tacoma Park wants to be a leader. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Can you,
Steve Davies, 6717 Poplar Avenue, and I was co-chair of the task force on environmental action.
that's what I was going to ask you.
I'm sorry.
Can you give a copy of that to the clerk?
Sure, absolutely.
Thanks. And I'll just add that last or next to last item on the streetlight purchase, I'll just comment that municipalities have been investigating it, and municipalities in Prince George's and Montgomery jointly have put up money for somebody to act on our behalf before the Public Service Commission on the streetlight rates, and we're going to be getting a report on that Thursday evening at our Montgomery County chapter meeting.
Oh, that's great.
So we've been working on it, and we're getting an update this week.
Okay. Can I email you?
Sure.
Find out what happened?
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Any other comments on the second reading ordinance on the speed hump on the 200 block of Grant Avenue? Okay. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Williams.
Aye.
Councilmember Wright.
Aye.
Councilmember Clay. Councilmember Robinson.
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens.
Aye.
Councilmember Snipper.
Aye.
Councilmember Schultz.
Aye.
Okay, that passes unanimously, and I guess we're still having problems getting Councilmember Clay linked in. Is she on? Councilmember Clay, are you there? Doesn't sound like it. Okay, then we will record that as a 6-0 vote. Oh, did I hear a voice?
You want me to take over?
No. We'll go for the next one. The next item is the second reading ordinance authorizing reimbursement to Maryland National Capital Park and Planning for demolition of 6502 Sligo Mill Road. Somebody like to introduce that one?
I'll introduce that. Second.
Moved by Councilmember Robinson, second by Councilmember Wright. Is there any council discussion on this item? Is there any public comment on this item? Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Williams.
Aye.
Councilmember Wright.
Aye.
Councilmember Clay. Councilmember Robinson.
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens.
Aye.
Councilmember Snipper.
Aye.
Councilmember Schultz.
Aye.
Okay, that's a unanimous vote. The next item is a resolution endorsing community development block grant projects. Maybe Sarah Daines wants to tell us a thing or two before we introduce that one?
Good evening. The council is being asked to consider this evening a resolution endorsing 2 community development block grant projects, which, if approved by the city council, would be forwarded to the Montgomery County for final review and approval. Funding would be available later in FY12. There are 2 projects. The first community service project is the Crossroads Farmers Market. The review committee is recommending full funding of their request in the amount of $25,000. This would provide for the continuation of their Fresh Checks program. Many of you may be aware of the fact that there is a 3-year limit on organizations requesting funding for basically the same project. So this would be the third year and the final year that they would be awarded block grant funds for this specific project if it's approved. And the organization has been advised of that. The second capital project is the continuation of the city's facade easement program. You may recall that a couple of years ago, we allocated a small portion of the CDBG funding for a project along New Hampshire Avenue corridor. We're proposing to expand that to include all of the commercial areas that are in CDBG-eligible block groups, which is essentially everything but Old Town and then the Ethan Allen Gateway, which is where the building burned down earlier this year. If that's endorsed by the council, we would make basically grants available to the business owners or the property owners in an amount equal to $10,000 per storefront. It would be provided on a matching basis and would take the form of a facade easement that would remain in place for a period of 5 to 7 years.
Any council questions? Somebody like to move the resolution? Moved by Councilmember Snipper. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Councilmember Schultz. Any further council discussion? Councilmember Wright.
I just had a question. Do we have any sense about the Crossroads Farmers Market being closer to sustainable?
I am meeting with them in 2 weeks to have that conversation. I know it's an ongoing issue with the group, and just informally I've encouraged them when they apply for grant funds from other organizations, because they've been quite successful in that they factor in, set aside or include in their budgets operating revenues, because right now they've been focusing a lot of their energies on the actual Fresh Check reimbursement itself, and they need to sort of think bigger than that so that they can continue to operate and have us reimburse the market masters for their time. And then I believe they're also looking at charging a vendor's fee, which is something that they have not done up to this date, just to encourage vendors to participate in the market.
Do we have a sense of how long the typical farmers market takes to become sustainable?
I do not know the answer to that question. I can find out.
That would be helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously wouldn't prevent me from, I'm supportive of that effort, but it just, it's been an ongoing concern of ours, or mine, and I know have given them funds in the past, and so I just raised that as a concern. It wouldn't stop me from voting for the
Frankly, I'm a
resolution.
little curious myself.
Councilmember Schultz.
Thank you, Mayor. I had the opportunity to attend a Crossroads Farmers Market Board meeting last week purely as an observer, since I don't have a role on that board. And I think when the information comes out as to the market's performance this year, the accomplishments will be extraordinary. As to Councilmember Wright's question about other money, the USDA Deputy Secretary for the programs, I don't know his title, such as the WIC program, the SNAP program, which used to be called food stamps, and other programs of that nature, is going to be coming to the Crossroads Market this coming Wednesday to see it, because of his interest in using this market as a model for other markets that are directed to low and moderate income people throughout the United States. And in that regard, the market has an application into the USDA, which would, I think, somewhere in the area of about $50,000, which would be their first federal grant. Plus, they have a number of other granting sources. So while I am not knowledgeable enough to give any reassurance to Councilmember Wright or anybody else as to that, the staff there can do that very ably when the time is appropriate. But I do think the thing is making great strides.
This has been one of their most successful market years to date.
Yep, it's broken all kinds of records.
And the event on Wednesday, if you have an opportunity to attend that, I would strongly encourage you. It's a big deal, and there are going to be some formalities or ceremonial things associated with that.
I'm distracted by what sounds like vermin in the back. Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. And I just wanted to echo what Ms. Dane said. This was their most successful market year, both in the number of vendors, the number of patrons, and in the support they've received. And again, I also attend many of their board meetings as an observer, and I lend my sage advice occasionally, but they're doing great, and certainly their goal is to become self-sufficient, so they are not dependent on the grants.
I believe they're getting about 500 customers each market day, which is really phenomenal.
Well, it's a significant growth over last year, and so I look forward to having them come before the council and give a report. Thank you. And I certainly support this recommendation of the staff. Thank you.
Councilmember Robinson.
My question is about the facade improvement grants along New Hampshire. Maybe I missed it. Do you have some facades already in mind to improve? Have you had conversations with businesses there yet?
What we're hoping to be able to do is, you may recall a couple of weeks ago, we'd asked the council to adopt a resolution authorizing us to apply for community legacy funds.
Yes.
I'm always optimistic, but my sense is that if we are funded for that project, it will not be to this level that we would like. And we're anticipating being able to pull from those lists of people that expressed an interest in participating in that program and sort of move them over into the facade program, as well as take additional applications from people that might be interested.
Okay. Now I'm recalling that, and given that, and given that I have an office building that's near New Hampshire Avenue, and it might be that I'm a beneficiary, I'll excuse myself from voting on this particular item.
I don't see any other council comments. Is there any public comment on the resolution endorsing community development block grant projects? Okay. All those in favor, please.
Introduced?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Never mind.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And one abstention. Next item is a resolution ratifying a collective bargaining agreement with AFSCME. Didn't know if Deputy City Manager wants to say anything about this item.
No, I'm glad it's before you. We went through a long negotiating season. The AFSCME local ratified the agreement on September 24th, and it now comes to you for your part of that ratification.
Okay. Somebody like to introduce this?
Move.
Moved by Councilmember Snipper. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Councilmember Siemens. Any council discussion? I'll just say I'm glad we got agreement, and that it's a 4-year agreement, and with some various openers, but some pretty good agreement and pretty good process to get there. So I congratulate staff who worked on this from all sides. Did I ask for public comment? Is there any public comment? Okay. All those in favor of this resolution, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That's unanimous. The next item is a resolution supporting the community investment tax credits for Rebuilding Together Montgomery County. Ms. Daines.
As the mayor's indicated, you have a resolution of support for Rebuilding Together Montgomery County. It's for a tax application that they're hoping to submit to the state of Maryland to to provide funding for their program that's available throughout the county. Many of you may be familiar with that, where they go and they provide, through the use of community volunteers, the wherewithal needed to make necessary repairs to the homes of low-income and otherwise qualified families, and focusing on seniors and families with children.
And they need us to pass this resolution
The
in order to
resolution
make,
is required by the program.
in order to make anybody who might be in this area eligible.
Correct. I should have you do this.
Is there any council comment on this item? Any public comment? Did we not move this one?
No.
All right, somebody who wants to move it. Councilmember
Move.
Snipper moves it.
Second.
Councilmember Robinson seconds. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That carried unanimously. The final regular meeting item is a resolution supporting Montgomery County's ambulance reimbursement fee and urging voters to vote yes on the referendum. Would somebody like to move?
I'd like to move it.
I'll second it.
Moved by Councilmember Seaman, second by Councilmember Schultz. I was contacted by some folks who are putting together the fairly last-minute effort to get the word out to folks that this is important. We have a fact sheet here that is put together by those in support, and it basically says that the reimbursement will raise needed revenues, that county residents will not be required to pay anything, that it's billed to insurance companies, and that uninsured residents will not be charged. We're one of the few areas in this region that does not have the fee. It's basically built into insurance rates already, so people's insurance rates shouldn't go up because they are set regionally. There's no evidence that it'll dissuade people from calling 911, and that this will be something that's really important to make sure that the revenues are there to support the services that are needed for emergency response. And there are efforts underway to say that this will keep people from, it'll make people reluctant to call 911. We're told that there's no evidence of that, and it just seems to me that people are capable of understanding that nothing will really change except the billing of insurance companies, and it seems fairly clear to me that this is the way to go. Councilmember Wright.
We'll just say very supportive of this. I think it should actually be called something like the fair collection of insurance fees for ambulance services, or as opposed to ambulance fee, reimbursement fee. And I just haven't really seen any credible argument about why this shouldn't be instituted. And I actually think it's a little bit of a shame now, because there's been a lot of effort put in fighting against this, and if even a small amount of that effort could have been put in, and I think should be put in going forward, to make it very clear to people that they're not going to be denied service if they call and don't have insurance, and that there's no worry, people should have no worry about calling 911 to get an ambulance fee, an ambulance service. If that time had been spent in that way, you know, there'd be no potential negative impact. So I think we'll have to do a little positive public service announcement about it.
Councilmember Seaman.
Thank you, Mayor. I introduced this resolution because I strongly support it. I think it's a shame that this has become such a political issue, but not for factual reasons, but for reasons beyond the benefit to the community. And I'm thankful that my colleagues are supportive of this motion.
Any other comments? Is there any public comment on this resolution? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. And if I can just ask my colleagues to let me know if there's somebody who might be available on, potentially on Wednesday, to go to Rockville to represent us at a press conference about this. I'm not going to be available, so if somebody wants to cover that, that would be most welcome. We'll now move to our work session item, and this is the staff comments on Task Force on Environmental Action Report and our discussion of the recommendations. And I've talked with the city manager about how we might do this, and the thought is that we would, that staff could present comments for a section at a time, and then if we've got questions about that section, we can cover that, and then we'll move to a different section, and we'll try and work our way through this in a fairly methodical way. We will not, I'm fairly sure, get through the whole thing this evening. As I said, we have another discussion scheduled next week for this, and the potential for additional sessions as we need to go through this and work our way through and come to where we want to get to. So if staff wants to start off with the first section, I'm assuming you want to go in order that they're in the packet?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick it off. Ask Daryl and Susie if they could join us, and I think Sarah will be down later as we move forward. Just would like to take the opportunity first to publicly express my appreciation to the Task Force on Environmental Action. I've worked with a lot of citizen task forces and committees, I guess, in my 20-plus years in government, and I think this is one of the best efforts I've seen. Just extremely thorough, and I know how much time all the members of the task force put into this. As I noted on the cover sheet, I think one of the challenges as staff went through and tried to provide some helpful comments to the council is that we haven't had the benefit of your guidance in terms of what you may have in mind in terms of a budget. Certainly there's lots of very good ideas in the report. The extent to which they can be implemented and the pace at which they can be implemented ultimately depends on resources. So my hope as we go through this tonight is certainly not asking the council to make, definitive decisions, but if there's certain items that the council in particular has interest in and may want more information, perhaps you could flag that for us, or even do your own little straw poll, just so as we go through the multiple work sessions on the report, we could start narrowing the field of items that the council may have some interest in. With that, to kind of help us ourselves go through this report, Jesse and I worked together and tried to figure out what was the best way we could format this, and what we ultimately concluded was just to try to pull out those recommendations from the task force, put them in the chart that is before you. Certainly there are many nuances to the recommendations. We were just trying to put it in an easy bullet format just for our own ease. You will notice you look through the document included with the agenda packet is there are some that are noted as high priority recommendations, and those are highlighted in yellow. Those were the high priority recommendations that were flagged by the task force themselves. Just going through each section, as the mayor indicated, one of probably the key recommendation of the task force was the creation of a sustainability coordinator position. They had, I think their preference would be to do that by the end of 2010, though they did note in their own comments that the city was going through some difficult financial times, but I think their goal, as they stated in their report, was that such a position could be created in either immediately or within 2 years. I think staff would agree with the task force that right now, given the fact that we had just gone through a period of layoffs not too long ago, as well as wage freezes, that it may take a little bit of time to actually have the funding to put this recommendation into place, so ultimately that is a decision of the council. One of the things, if the council does move forward with creating such a position, is that the council be very clear in terms of what your focus is, what your priority projects are, because certainly you would need to try to create a position that had the skill set that would lend itself towards meeting those objectives. One idea that I had thrown out and is included is, depending on what the council sees this position doing, is whether or not you might want to have some discussions with other municipalities about possibly creating a position that could be shared. You actually do see this concept sometimes in rural areas, even with city managers, where you might have a city manager actually work for 3 different municipalities, and there is an example of that in Maryland on the Eastern Shore. So that may just be something for you all to consider. I'm not sure what the feasibility of that is unless we have some direction from the council to explore it, but certainly there are a number of municipalities in Maryland that I think have a similar environmental bent as Tacoma Park and may be facing similar challenges in terms of funding for resources. The only other comment that staff wanted to offer in terms of the creation of a position is you're never probably going to find one person who can do everything. And certainly as we look through the many recommendations of the task force, some of them are very technical in nature and would likely require supplemental resources besides just creating a position. So I think as we go through this, we'd just encourage you to keep that in mind. Mayor, did you want to go through the entire section, or did you want to stop at each item?
Why don't we try stopping at an item?
Okay.
And that way I think maybe we can maintain our focus a little bit better. And we'll see how it goes, and maybe we need to change and
Sure.
go to broader categories before we comment. But if I can just start on this one and say my reaction is that, and I'm kind of looking to my colleagues to see whether this is an accurate reflection, but my sense is that we would like to be able to come up with a way to put together various priorities as we go through this, leading to aiming at hiring somebody, whether it be a full-time sustainability coordinator, whether it be sharing with another municipality, whether it be a contractor position. Exactly how it's going to work partly depends on the financial situation, partly depends on the types of things that we decide are the priorities as we go through this. But my sense is that everybody thinks it might be a good idea to keep that in mind, that we want to eventually get to that. Is that a fair representation of where people are?
I'd add one thing, and that is, I don't know if a sustainability coordinator can be tasked with finding ways to save money for the city through reduced use and so forth, but if such a person could pay for themselves, that would be a lesser impact on our budget, might even be a positive impact. So that's what I'd be looking at.
Councilmember Schultz.
In concept, my first reaction to the sustainability coordinator idea is that it's a really good idea. It's just the wrong time. After having laid off a number of employees this past fiscal year, and the prospects are unknown for the next fiscal year, but nobody seems to be saying, oh boy, we can't wait till we get to the next budget analysis time of the year. The idea is it's just unfortunately not the time to be doing this. So I like the city manager's suggestion of maybe sharing a sustainability person among 2 or 3 municipalities. Or another idea might be to try to provide staff with outside training in the area of sustainability, such that people in various departments, Public Works, Department of Housing, Community Development, would have better information and know-how with regard to sustainability, environmental sustainability, which would be obviously a big compromise from what the task force recommends, but it might be a step in that direction that at least builds skill within our existing employee base. Thank you.
Councilmember Wright.
To me, I think this is key, and I think we should plan to look at it in the next budget cycle. We can't do it within this budget cycle, and I've said this before, I do like the idea of figuring out a way to find a dedicated income stream, whether it's that we would be able to add on something to the stormwater management process earmarked for the environmental concerns. I don't know if that's legally possible as a tax method, and the other would be just to specifically designate a percentage of the property tax to this. I think residents are, not every resident, but the majority of residents of Tacoma Park are willing to pay for this, and if it's very clear and we're able to articulate the dollars that they're paying for what they're getting, they'd be willing to support it. And I think this is one of the main things that we would need to pay for, not the only one, a significant thing we need to pay for to implement many of the recommendations in the report.
Councilmember Schultz, did you have a comment?
I'm sorry. One important thing or thought that I wanted to share, completely forgot, is that in discussing this at this point in time, I think we need to be careful to sort of say that we don't say, oh, yes, if we can find the money, let's hire a sustainability coordinator, because if we were to add a position, say a full-time equivalent position, all of us are going to have to sit back and say, well, if we could add one position, what would that position be? It might not, there may be other priorities in the overall city strategy process in terms of, allocating our staff resources to other things or additional things other than just sustainability is as important as it seems to be. And I mean, we just can't sit here tonight and say, let's do that, because we don't know what the next year's budget's going to be, and it may be that we could allocate, a third of a person to sustainability. Next year, we may not be able to add anybody. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Just before I go back to Councilmember Wright, just let me say, kind of in response to that my sense is that what we need to do in the near future is to have the conversation with our residents where we do have the ability to know with some clarity, with more clarity than we now have, how important people feel it is to do something like have a sustainability coordinator or have the environmental push that the task force recommends, and that I think a lot of people emotionally and rationally want to do, how that balances against those other priorities that you talk about, whether it's that if it's important enough to do this, whether we're going to say, okay, that if it takes a position, that might require eliminating some other position because we have to do it within the budget constraints that we're operating under, or is it important enough that it does have some kind of dedicated funding source, or exactly how we approach it. We need to be sure that we're not just charging ahead and saying, oh, yes, let's do it, and then a whole bunch of people say, wait a minute, what happened to the budget problems? Why are you doing this? So we need that discussion, and I think this is a very important point in that whole discussion, where these environmental initiatives fit in that. We're basically adding new pieces to what we do. How do we do that? Councilmember Wright.
I guess I would just add, I get a little uncomfortable when council members from the dais speak in the we. So I'm speaking in the I, right? So I'm saying that I don't need additional information at this point. I'm confident that I can say that I think we need this position in the next budget. People can disagree, that's fine, but I just don't think we should speak up here in the we that we need more information or we want this. I'm just saying at this point, based on what I've heard, based on what I've seen, based on my conversations with residents, that they are willing to make a financial sacrifice to fund this position in the city. And maybe they would be willing to make that sacrifice for other positions also. We don't do a good job articulating what they're paying for and what they're getting. But I think if we can clearly articulate this one and can designate a piece of the property tax to it, I think we can either find money in the budget or people would be willing to pay a little bit more for this specific issue.
Any other comments? So I'd say this one is high priority, just as it was flagged.
The next one should just be very quick. I think the task force recommendations was that the city council commit a sufficient budget to implement the recommendations. Obviously, you're starting that process this evening in terms of trying to reach consensus on what your priorities are. I think as we get closer to the budget process and we have a better sense of what you want to do, we can certainly try to put some numbers to that to help you in your discussion. Kind of along the same lines, the task force had recommended that there be an implementation plan by the end of this calendar year to implement each recommendation included in their report. I guess the only comment staff would offer is the end of the calendar year is not that far off. The council actually, I believe, is scheduled to take December off, as you typically do. So that end of the year timeframe in terms of developing a full-blown implementation plan may be challenging. Ideally, from my perspective, if it's not done by the end of the calendar year, it would certainly be helpful to have a fairly good idea of what the council wants to do in the first quarter of 2011. That would certainly be helpful in terms of my putting together the recommended budget. I think it's noted on the item, and this is just probably a personal concern of mine. If we're spending a lot of time in the first quarter of the calendar year, still going kind of back and forth in terms of what items the council wishes to move into the next year's budget, that's also the peak workload time for all the city staff in terms of putting together the proposed budget for the council to review. So I think the sooner we can get an idea of what items you're most interested in, particularly those that would impact the FY12 budget, the easier it would be certainly for me putting together the budget for you for next year. Next item had to do with training and education of city staff. Probably the brief description that we put on this didn't exactly capture, I think, the whole nuance of what the task force had actually recommended. They had suggested that there be a city employee sustainability education program. When you actually read through the report in a little bit more detail, there were some secondary impacts talking about perhaps city staffs being trained and serving as both an advisor to the community as well as to other municipalities. I think what staff thought might be a reasonable starting point, given our existing resources, I think is along the same lines as the task force had recommended. And we had some internal discussions about sort of forming our own little green team group, kind of a multi-department team that would basically work together to identify small items and small improvements that the city staff could make. But I think most importantly, sort of to create a culture of sustainability, as we called it. I'm not sure that we probably have the resources perhaps to go out and be kind of serving as technical advisors to other municipalities. I think that may be challenging unless we actually have some additional resources that can focus on that. Are there any questions about that particular item?
Councilmember Wright.
I just thought what the staff came up, the vision of what the staff came up with here is a very appropriate approach, and I think that I wouldn't speak for the task force and for the environment, but I think they were trying to be, they were descriptive, but they're also trying to be prescriptive, and so to me, what you're suggesting here follows the prescriptive recommendation and says, this is what we actually think would be most helpful to the city staff, given the resources, and can have an impact. So I'm very supportive of that, and I think it makes sense to move forward with it.
Councilmember Snipper.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm very supportive of this. In my own conversations with city staff over the 20-whatever years I've lived, 25 years I've lived in Tacoma Park, I find many staff quite knowledgeable and very enthusiastic about environmental issues in general. And I think that this particular recommendation would be enthusiastically embraced by many members of the staff who have ideas and are just waiting for opportunities to suggest them, discuss them, work on them. I think there's a lot of creativity among the staff for how to do this. They're right at the ground level sometimes and can name a particular little thing that will actually save, if we do this and not do that. So I really like drawing on the staff in this fashion.
Councilmember Robinson.
I agree. I think it's great. It's sort of sustainability coordinator light.
And maybe what you can do is to tally, I'm back to my numbers hat on, not in great detail, but have some sense to report back to us the things that the Green Team and the culture of sustainability come up with that help us as a city and help staff. And that might be a way to better inform us when we get around to the sustainability coordinator discussion. So I'm fully supportive of that.
Councilmember Snipper.
Yes, something the federal government has started doing on this and other topics has proven very effective, and that's to run contests with actually small prizes. It is fascinating that people will, if you ask for suggestions, you won't get any suggestions. But if you do a contest with a small prize, then you'll get lots of contributions. It's just the way humans work. So I can provide some information if you want on how those kinds of things are done. But they get the juices flowing.
Councilmember Schultz.
Yeah, this training is, in a sense, what I was referring to in my previous remarks with regard to hiring a sustainability coordinator, which we can't do right now. But at least this will get us going in that direction. And as to kind of second what Councilman Robinson just said, is that it'll put us in a better position when the time comes to hire a sustainability coordinator to understand exactly what our expertise gaps are so that we can find that person that fills the particular gaps that our staff doesn't fulfill.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, sounds like there's some fairly clear direction on that one.
The next item that the task force had recommended was that the city explore new revenue streams for financing sustainability. One of the items they had mentioned was the possible levying of a real estate transfer tax. I did touch base with the city attorney, and they did advise us that at this time the city did not have the legal authority to do that. Certainly that is an item that the council could choose to work with other municipalities and try to get that legislative authority. I think it's probably that we're all painfully aware, sitting on this dais, is that Maryland municipalities currently have very limited ways of generating revenue. I think, as the council always does, you could certainly identify other ways of raising revenue and work with MML and other municipalities to try to lobby for changes to state legislation to give us more opportunities. And I know that is a priority, legislative priority of MML, and the mayor, as someone who sits on the legislative committee, certainly is very involved with that. I think it has already been mentioned, certainly it's within the council's authority to make a budget appropriation, whether that is devoting a percentage of the tax rate for certain items. And in certain cases, I think we do have a good sense from the city attorney, depending on the specific item, that some stormwater fees can be used, for example, to plant trees. So that is certainly something that is within the council's authority to do some of those items. As the staff worked through some of the recommendations in the report, it was our sense that some of them may be somewhat difficult to implement, and not necessarily for monetary reasons. I know Darrell and I had some discussions about composting facilities. I have never worked for a city that had them, but I'm familiar with some that have, and it does require quite a bit of land to implement. So there may be some of the recommendations of the task force that may just have some natural constraints beyond just an investment of money. Is any questions about that item?
I've got a question on the last point on the composting facility. Does it, the ones that have them, it makes sense to concentrate that as opposed to composting in your own yard? Are there particular realities of scale that argue one way or another on that?
I'm sure there are. We don't have a great background in it other than our own leaf composting operation, which is a far cry from a composting facility. It's really just a storage, and let's see what happens, and then we provide it to people for it to really decompose on their own properties in the way of ground leaves.
I ask that just because, I don't know, my reality of life to this point has always been to assume that one would have a compost pile in one's yard.
Right. The other issues you get in when you concentrate it is, of course, you get into a whole new range of zoning issues, health department issues, all kinds of regulatory frameworks, testing requirements. I mean, just anytime you're centralizing a process, you then bring with it all those governmental entities and regulatory bodies that have to review and approve, particularly location as well as what you're doing, and you have to verify what you're doing and what the end product is. There have been a few facilities that have tried to get started. Food composting-wise, there was one in Baltimore City for a short time. There was one out in Prince George's County for a short time. Most of them have either not been able to financially turn a corner, or else they end up in a regulatory problem with changing zoning ordinances or difficulty with public support of the location. It's been a little easier for yard waste operations in our general neck of the woods, but even they have some challenges. There hasn't yet been a food waste operation that's really gotten going, though I understand there is one that I was provided a link to that's trying to get started about an hour and a half from here. So we've been trading voicemails, and I haven't had a chance to talk to them yet.
So there are a lot fewer obstacles for smaller, individualized operations, and there might be potential there for some education and information.
Certainly, backyard operations is a whole different scale. We have in the past provided, how-to composting information. We supply the county composting bins, so they're very rudimentary. And if you really want to get into it in your own home, you have to come up with something a little more sturdy, a little more structured than that.
Okay. Thanks. Councilmember Ray.
So I, again, would take this one a little as being prescriptive as opposed to descriptive. So, and I also heard a lot of members on the task force are interested in continuing to do work on things if there was like a clear, specific goal here. And so I think it would be a very helpful subcommittee for us to actually ask them to look at this issue in depth. And
the revenue streams or the composting?
The composting issue in particular, if we think it's something that's compelling. There actually are businesses that are starting around the country that are collecting compost from restaurants. I think there's actually one in D.C. that's gotten underway. My understanding is they don't do it from households because the economics of it just don't work to pick up from every household. But maybe if the city did the collection, we wouldn't have to have the composting facility on site here. But if the city did the collection, then they would come pick it up from us from some central location. So I think it's things like that if we did really want to look at this, given the constraints that we don't really have the land to do this realistically, but if there's to push it back to a subcommittee of people who would really like to dig in on this issue. I don't mean a pun on that. I know it's composting. That probably a very interesting and feasible recommendation that could come back from that.
Councilmember Schultz.
This points up is a good example of something that I see throughout this report, is that this is a kind of issue for which I dare say there are folks who live in Tacoma Park. Maybe some of them were actually on this task force and were the ones who came up with this recommendation because they have background, familiarity with examples of how this works, has been made to work either here or, in Europe or other places where maybe it's been successful. The point is that there's a number of these kind of things throughout this task force report where I'd really love to be able to see the city to be in a position to pick the brains of some of the expertise that we have in our citizenry, because I'm just sure it's here on this and some other topics, so that Ms. Braithwaite can take advantage of that, where they can offer. I'm not proposing how to do that. I'm just saying that in general, I see that as something that's, because there's so much work that's gone into this report, and it's clearly been written by an array of people who've got a tremendous amount of knowledge. We shouldn't just abandon all that knowledge at this point. Thank you.
Next section.
I think I'm going to ask Susie to cover this one. It had to do with the creation of a sustainability website.
I think one of the things that we're excited about is that we're rethinking our existing city website, and many people are eagerly awaiting a new city website.
Do we have any sense on time frame on that?
Actually, it's going to be after the first of the year. We have had a little bit of a glitch, but in a good way.
Speaking of a glitch.
Speaking of, but I do want to say that the information that we would want on a sustainability website, I think I lost my, hello?
Testing.
We could talk with you. I think that the thing that we are looking for is a way to integrate this information into our existing website, because we don't want people going to lots of different websites. We'd like to be able to have a place where people can come, and then there can be certainly links and sections on our existing website to share that information. We feel that that would be a little bit more useful than setting up separate websites that have to be maintained.
Comments on this area? Councilmember Wright.
I think, again, this is an area where a subcommittee who really wanted to dig in on the idea of a sustainability website, their knowledge and expertise could really be incorporated and do a lot of the work for the city staff on a content perspective onto the revamped city website.
That'd be very welcome.
Yeah.
Okay.
The next item, I think, is one that is very familiar to the council. One of the task force recommendations was prohibiting the use of gasoline-powered leaf blowers. The council has had discussion of this. Don't remember the exact dates. As we talked about at that time, there are certainly examples of communities that have successfully either limited use or abandoned gas-powered leaf blowers altogether. Clearly, this would require an ordinance for the council to implement. One of the possible concerns is just simply the enforcement. I'm sure a lot of folks are like me who do their yard work on the weekend. And at that time, really the staff that would be on hand to enforce any violations of any ordinance would fall to the police department. And certainly their main priority would be, as it is today, to continue to fight crime. And I think the council would probably share my concern that nothing detract from that. One option, which is up to the council discretion, is whether or not, as an alternative to a ban, you would just wish to essentially educate people and encourage them not to use gas-powered leaf blowers. This is ultimately a legislative matter. I don't think staff had a recommendation one way or the other than to simply note the enforcement might be a concern. We included on the information in the agenda packet what we had given you previously, which really talked about the impact on the Public Works Department if the city staff were no longer allowed to use gasoline-powered leaf blowers. The largest impact really would probably be in the gardens. Darrell, please correct me if I miss anything, but I think the estimated cost would probably be about $3,000 to $4,000 a year, and taking a little bit more time to get some work done if they were using rakes as opposed to leaf blowers. Darrell, anything you wanted to add?
Councilman Robinson.
I visited a couple of towns and did some research on the enforcement aspects of this, and I came back, started thinking that there should be no question we should just ban them entirely. And when I came back and thought it over,
the enforcement issues and the aspects of kind of neighbor versus neighbor made me change my mind. I do think that we ought to stop using leaf blowers ourselves, and I think we ought to use that as part of our outreach to help others see that it may be a little more trouble to rake the leaves, but it gives you some exercise. You get a good feeling of not putting pollutants in the air, and keeps the noise level down. And I think it's a big task to make that educational push, but I'm for it.
Councilmember Wright?
I would agree with the education campaign. I would agree that the city should stop using them. I would even like to put to a vote the idea of a seasonal ban. I know this is something that when it came up before, I think the council has a slightly different composition, but there was an interest in this, which is basically banning in the times when you think someone wouldn't actually need to use a leaf blower because there's not a lot of leaves falling from trees. So, you allow them in the heart of the fall and spring, and not during the summer and winter, obviously. And often they're used in the summertime, but it's more to blow dust around than actually pick up leaves.
And I'll just add on this one that I've never been sure that banning them was the way that I would vote to go. In the intervening time after this issue came up until now, I would say that I got some education out of this particular item. I still own my gas-powered leaf blower, but I now own a battery-powered leaf blower, which has taken the place of the gas-powered leaf blower for a number of uses, mainly the off-season uses, trying to, if I cut the grass and I want to blow off the driveway and the sidewalk, I'm not blowing dust, but I'm blowing cut leaf bits and cut grass bits, and it does a very adequate job for very little money, and it's much more convenient. I don't have to worry about whether the gas-oil mixture is fresh enough to use, whether I left any in the blower and it's going to, foul the mechanisms and it's not going to start anyway. Battery, just make sure it's charged, plug it in, go, do your thing, and it's been very handy. But I do know that when it comes to the heavy-duty leaf season, I want to be able to use my gas-powered leaf blower to get that big bunch of leaves, along with rakes. Tends to be two people with rakes and me, the occasional blower, and we get the job done. I know I've heard from a couple of residents just in the most recent time frame who said, gee, we have people who do it. If we have to tell them they can't use their leaf blowers, we're going to be at a real disadvantage, et cetera, et cetera. So I have heard recently from people who are really opposed to this and said, we'll come down and storm City Hall if you're going to consider this, just for what it's worth. And so I haven't really changed my position on how I would vote if it came to a vote on this item, but I have gotten education and I have modified my practices.
So education works.
Yes. If one's mind is open to it. Any other comments on this one? I haven't heard anybody say we should do a ban, but I think people are for education. Is that a fair straw poll? Should we do a straw poll on this one?
How about banning our use? Do you have a sense of that?
I didn't. My sense is that
there were two council members who seemed to be supportive of that, but I'm not sure what everyone else thinks.
Why don't we do a straw poll on that one? Banning city use of gasoline-powered leaf blowers. I see two. And Councilmember Clay was online for a while and had difficulty and is not online at this point participating, but she was here for a while.
Okay.
Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. I just, one of the things that I thought we were going to have in this staff report was some estimate of the additional cost. Well, I see you have the additional cost for the gardens. I'm not sure if that's for the whole thing. If we're talking $3,000 to $4,000 for the year across the city?
For the garden work, yeah.
For the garden
It's hard to capture some of the additional other costs, particularly in our mowing operation or our debris clearing. Debris clearing is largely done by contractor, whether or not they charge us anymore for a non-leaf, non-blow street cleanup. We just haven't explored that yet. The mowing, it just will add time to our cycle. There won't be a perceptible cost increase. It'll just take us longer to get around to our mowing cycle. So we just add time, we don't add cost.
And when you add time,
Yeah, but
there's less
time is
work
money,
done.
right?
Well,
If not, then we got a lot of things we can have people do.
whether or not our cycle generally takes us 2 weeks. Our mowing cycle currently takes us 2 weeks. With an addition like this, it'd probably be 2.5 weeks. So, what that translates into in terms of whether the public would even be aware, I'm sure there's some times of the year where grass is growing very fast, but probably most of the time, as long as it's getting regularly, as long as you see somebody out there, whether it's every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks, I don't have a sense that would be
So it's more a matter of the grass will grow a little higher. Is that what you're saying?
It takes us longer to do it without the
Get
blower.
around to it. So-
If we're bagging and if we're brooming, it's going to take us longer to complete a park than it does now.
Which also means something else doesn't get done.
Well, during the mowing cycle, we have a full-time person and a temp, and that's what they do, basically May through September, providing that the grass is in season. So that's their 5-day-a-week, 40 hours a week job.
So it's back to the grass ends up getting a little higher before it gets cut again. Do I have that right?
So it isn't necessarily that something doesn't get done, it's just that the grass doesn't get cut as often, and
Yeah, for that particular example, again, that's the mowing example. We've given the garden example, some of the contractual work we don't have much experience with yet.
So in the mowing example, why does it take on, is it because the people are doing other things also, or we don't use leaf blowing in the mowing operation, leaf blowers in the mowing operation, do we, or do we?
We do. We do. Basically, grass clippings, cleaning the sidewalks, cleaning the curb line. This is totally sideline, but one of the things I'd like to see us do, speaking of grass clippings, is do an education campaign to the residents not to leave grass clippings in the gutter line and on the sidewalk. It amazes me the amount of debris that people leave after they're done. Because it just ends up in our storm drains and stinks and rots and, totally offline. But at any rate, yeah, it just adds time, because we do use blowers now for the operation. And, if they're doing the edger, cleaning up after that, it throws a lot of dirt around. So,
is there any sense, I'm becoming more convinced that we could go that route, and I'm wondering if there's a reason to say, use the ones we got as they need to be replaced, replace them with something else?
we've looked into that. At this point, the assumption is, when we last explored it, is the horsepower of the battery-powered or electric ones are simply not as strong. The issue with the battery-powered ones is they wouldn't last an 8-hour day. They probably wouldn't last 4 hours. So there'd be this issue of you need multiple ones or multiple batteries, and could result in it going back and forth to get your battery charger. We explored running a generator and electric. That just is impractical. So you pretty much have to use the battery option.
Darrell, do you bag the grass clippings, or do you...
No, we blow them onto the lawn.
Blow them onto the lawn, okay.
Yeah, the grass clippings where they collect in the baggers, because we do have grass catchers as well on the mowers, and we take that back to the yard and put it on our leaf operations. So there's very little yard waste that gets disposed of.
I just find it hard for us to be able to do a legitimate public education campaign if we ourselves, as the city operations, don't take steps not to use the gas-powered leaf blowers. And what it sounds like is that the grass would get cut a little less frequently and would cost us $3,000 to $4,000 a year. Is there some other cost that we're not?
Unless we had an equipment change out, yeah, and, additional costs for contractors.
But we'd save on purchase of additional leaf blowers over time, too, right?
If we're not using any
we're not
versus
using
an alternative type.
But, yeah, I mean, given the costs you've outlined, I would be supportive of a ban by this, for city use, for city government use. And then it'll be interesting to see how we word that so that if, as the technology progresses, that there may be an alternative that comes forward that is acceptable.
I'll go there as well.
Yeah, same here. So there's
Okay, so
there's some direction.
we have support on that one.
We're in the weeds on that one.
Well, it's okay. It'll blow over.
Okay, I'm going to stop you all before you go too much down this path. The next recommendation the task force had was reducing the use of two-cycle and other gasoline-powered engines through education and outreach and trade-in programs. I think staff agrees that this would be the preferred approach relative, as opposed to an outright prohibition. There would obviously be some resources that would need to be dedicated to educational materials and an outreach. I believe the mayor may have actually participated in this, if I recall.
Yes, I
but
did.
The state recently did a trade-in program, and I think the question the staff had is whether other entities basically having trade-in programs was sufficient, or was the council so inclined to have the city basically do its own, which obviously requires a different level of resource commitment.
I'd love to have the city be able to participate in something like the program that the Council of Governments and Clean Air Partners did this summer, thanks to Councilmember Schultz's heads up from the COG effort. I immediately went to the website and said, yes, I want to participate, and I got my new Newton battery-powered mower at about one-third the cost of what it would normally be, and it works great, and I love it. And I never met a non-gasoline-powered lawnmower that I liked before this one, but I like this one.
It's called a Newton?
Newton, N-E-U-T-O-N, like a little squiggly Newton.
Or Sir Isaac.
Or Sir Isaac, but with an N-E-U-T-O-N.
Oh, N-E-U.
N-E-U-T-O-N. It's a great piece of machinery,
Great.
and it's got attachments, it's got all kinds of things you can do with it. So there is technology out there that it'll go through 6 inches of tall grass.
Wow.
So there is something that is easy to use, and on a program like that, inexpensive. I don't know what the city could work. Maybe they're going to do this same type of thing again with a publicity campaign. I'm sure there were, I think it was for 1,000 of these around in the Baltimore, Washington region, and it was a great operation. They used volunteers. They partnered with the company. It ran very smoothly because they got 1,000 people to exchange their old. I turned in 2 gas mowers for 1 battery powered. I only had to come up with 1, but I came up with 2.
Right.
And they did it in very quick order. I think I figured out that they had to run people through 1 person every 2 minutes through this process, and it went like clockwork. So if somebody else is doing it, great. If they're not doing it and we can come up with a similar type of deal, I'd love to put that together.
Yeah, I think staff's feeling was that if we could, partner with COG or other entities in the region, there would just be some efficiencies that would not only benefit our residents, but others in the metropolitan area.
To get more Newtons, I'll get one.
Sure.
Is there any possibility we could just prohibit growing grass?
You throw a bunch of rocks on your yard,
Good
and that would
idea,
probably stop
yeah.
it.
That's a good idea. Rain gardens.
Certainly resolve some of the fertilization runoff problems.
Certainly. If you want to grow grass, move to the other side of the city line. Move to Silver Spring. Just an idea.
You're not suggesting we pave our front lawns, are you?
We don't want to ban leaf blowers, but we want to ban grass.
Gee, right when the district is going to legalize.
I mean, I can't get any to grow in my front yard, and I've been trying for 24 years.
It's only 9 o'clock.
I know. It's early for this.
One of the recommendations of the task force was to enact a strict anti-idling law. As we noted in the agenda materials, the Public Works Department actually has implemented a campaign for its own staff. In considering this issue, really kind of looked to Chief Rakucci in terms of the enforcement, because once again, I think it probably would fall to the police department. His sense is that there would be some difficulty in enforcing it. And I think the council may have its own opinion on this. I think from staff's perspective, we were wondering how much resources would have to be directed to something that we're not sure is a significant problem, but perhaps the task force has information that we did not. Chief did ask that we note that any unattended vehicle that is left idling is in fact already a violation of state law, and it is enforced if the police department does see that. Once again, I think depending on which direction the council wishes to go, there's been a lot of discussion both in the report and I think among staff in terms of education. This is certainly an area, if the council so chooses, that we can work with the community in terms of educating people about the impacts of idling. I guess those were the comments that staff had to offer on that item.
Councilmember Snipper.
Thank you, Mayor. One of the joys of having a Prius is it's automatically anti-idling, because when you come to a stop, the whole thing shuts off, becomes completely quiet in addition to not idling.
Almost
So,
hit by one of those quiet things.
well, there's that problem. If you're standing still, you're less likely to get hit. And over time, as more of these kinds of vehicles are in use, that will lessen this issue.
And it sounds like we do have an anti-idling law that can be enforced.
Provided the vehicle is left unattended, correct?
Anything more on that one? Councilmember Wright.
I mean, I'd have to look at the specifics of the state law, but it does seem reasonable to have this law in our city. I mean, it is one of those things where to have an anti-idling law in our city. Maybe the state, there's probably times about how long you can leave it on, right? Like,
I think with the state, the issue is that it's unattended. It's viewed as being sort of a...
At all.
Yeah, right. As long as it's unattended, it doesn't matter how long, as long as the police officer notices a car with no one in it that is running. So if you actually go out, and I think there's been some instances of this where people will turn their car on to let it warm up and leave it in the driveway. If you're not in it, that's a violation of state law. I think some of the questions the police department had sort of posed is, in order to be really determining it's a violation, is how long does it have to idle, and an officer would actually have to be timing it. So if it was, you can't leave it idling more than 5 minutes, that may be too long, then an officer would literally need to have a starting point in terms of the time and an ending point before he or she could issue a ticket. If you had, people waiting in front of the school, waiting for their child with their car running, would that be a violation? So I think those were just some of the questions that we sort of kicked around internally, and I think that's what led to the comment that there could be some difficulty in enforcing. We're not saying it's impossible, but it would certainly be somewhat challenging.
Yeah, I guess I just think if we are going to do an education campaign about it, there's value in also having a law, realizing that there's many laws that have, are problematic around enforcement, but put a stake in the ground about what we think is right and legal in the city, and would, support residents who go up to people and say very kindly, would you not have your car idling or your moving truck idling? And people blow them off, they'd be able to say, it's also against the law in this city. I think this, so.
Councilmember Robinson.
I'm okay with just going with the state law, but having, as Mr. Davies suggested in his comments earlier, kind of a top 10 things you can do as a citizen to cut CO2 output, get a battery-powered Newton, don't use your leaf blower, don't idle, other things like that, which have a clear impact, and maybe put it on a small card so that the person who Josh recognizes as an astute citizen with a sense of community mindedness can hand the person who's in the car idling one of these little cards. Not only is it against the law, but here's why we support not idling.
Councilmember Schultz.
I like the education component because I think, using myself as an example, a lot of drivers, including me, sometimes would say to themselves, well, it's more it's inefficient to turn off my engine and then turn it on again. I'm just going to waste more gas, create more pollution if I do that than if I sit here and let the engine run. And I think people need to understand that that's not the case, or it would be the case if you turned it on and off every, just for 15 seconds or something like that. But to let your car sit there and idle for 2-3 minutes, it's in other words, what are the parameters so that people get educated and can see it's in their own interest, not only the community's interest, to turn off their engines.
Councilmember Snipper.
Thank you, Mayor. One of the difficulties with enforcement was alluded to by the city manager, that when it's 100 degrees out and you're waiting for your kid to come into the car, or correspondingly it's 20 degrees out and you're waiting for somebody to come out and you're sitting in your car, that's often when people leave their engines running. I do think that a little education, that you don't need to have it necessarily on for the 15 minutes you're sitting there, that you can turn it on and off and it will work. But I think if you tried to do enforcement on some situation like that, it would not be very effective.
Councilmember Robinson.
I just think I'm going to follow up, Fred, on your comment there. Just a little bit of a story. We're lucky on the East Coast to have so much salt on the freeways because our cars rot out in a reasonable period of time. And the cars that where that really was the case, when you turned it off and you turned it on and it wasted more gas than if you just let it running, were carburetor cars. And my story is that when my spouse and I were in Albuquerque a few years ago, I saw on a one stretch of 4th Avenue north-south, there, in a 2-block range, there were 3 carburetor rebuild shops. This was just a couple of years ago. So it's too bad that in New Mexico their cars last so long and they have all these carburetor cars. But in our neck of the woods, I think it's really because of fuel injection doesn't waste gas when you turn it off and turn it back on again. So that's something I learned.
Okay, I stand educated.
There you go.
So where are we on this in terms of whether people want to go with enforcing the state law with an education campaign, or do people want a city law that bans idling? I'm not clear where the group is on this.
Education campaign.
Yeah,
Okay.
I thought we were state law with education.
But that's not what I heard everywhere.
Education.
That's why we repeated it, so you'd hear it.
Okay, good. Thank you. Why don't we do one more?
Okay. The last item under the air quality recommendations was a suggestion to clearly ban open burning by adopting the Montgomery County language. We reviewed this issue with the city attorney's office, and Linda Perlman did note that the city has not opted out of the county's air quality control law, so therefore we already are subject to that. Her recommendation was either that the city code be amended to just clarify this point, Or alternatively, we could just delete any reference to open burning in the city code altogether, which by default then means that it's under the county law. And once again, certainly, regardless of which law we're under, we can certainly provide some educational materials about open burning and its impacts.
So is there any reason, pro or con in general, to fall under the county code or have our own?
If we have our own code, we're subject to enforcing it. If it's under the county enforces it.
And therefore, we get some services for which we pay taxes.
That would be correct.
You get the open burning police, special police force from Montgomery County to come down.
And will they tell us that, gee, we're awful far from Rockville and they don't get down this far very often for enforcement?
I don't know. We haven't had occasion to call them. I always not that I know of in my tenure, too. Daryl, you're nodding your head. Have we ever had to call?
No, but I remember when I moved here 20 years ago, everybody said no open burning. So I think it's a widely held understanding in our area that Montgomery County prohibits it, and I have never seen open burning. I mean, I'm sure it goes on, but I'm not aware of it as a resident or a city employee.
I thought I saw it for the first time ever about 2 weeks ago, and it turned out to be a neighbor's car exhaust.
Oh, my God.
This car was idling.
Yeah, I think
it was one of those carbureted ones.
The task force did note in its report that, to quote them, that it's not clear how significant a problem open burning is in Tacoma Park. There have been reports of the burning of materials in several neighborhoods.
And there's ceremonial burning that's noted here. You need a permit for that, so I think we're okay on that.
So it does sound like we would just clean up the code to make it clear that
right.
we don't have some different language on what the county.
That's correct, and that's what Linda Perlman recommended, is that there just be some clearing
and
up.
education that is county law and the city falls under that, and here's what you can do and here's what you can't do.
Correct.
Okay. That gets us to the end of the second section, and I think maybe we can stop there. We'll pick up next week with the buildings section. We'll go through these in the same manner that we have up to this point, and we'll also have a chance to say, well, gee, I think there's something else that I read in the report that staff seems to have left out. Any of those opportunities, if you feel that there is one and you want to alert the city manager offline, and she can pull together staff's comments on that or anything else that occurs to us at these meetings that we want to bring up that seems like it's not being covered. As we get farther through, we'll know what those items are.
Yeah, thank you.
And if the task force has any additional information that members want to bring to our attention, please do so as we go through this. And there will be an opportunity after we get a little bit farther along to bring the task force more formally into the work session process and get their input as we go through. But I figured if we don't, people from the task force don't want to be here every week as we go through this stuff. If we get farther through and then bring them in for a chance for kind of rebuttal and comment, they might welcome that opportunity. So we'll take a short break, and we'll come back for our last items, which are the State Highway Administration.
Over the past month. On September 7th, we discussed a proposal by Maryland Secretary of Transportation Beverly Swain Staley, which was for the state to repave sections of Ethan Allen and Flower Avenues in Tacoma Park during the coming spring and summer. And if the city of Tacoma Park would give the land it owns under Route 410 to the state would then delist Route, we got a question, I don't know if delist is the right word, but it suddenly wouldn't be a state highway, which currently it is Route 787, which is Flower Avenue between Carroll Avenue and Piney Branch Road, so that it would not be a state highway, and leave it to be maintained by the city of Tacoma Park and to a limited extent Montgomery County. I've had quite a few discussions with state and county officials, with staff in the Environmental Protection Agency, with other jurisdictions, and in talking with a person at the state, and based on some of our comments, they've modified their proposal somewhat, and that modified proposal would be that besides turning over the land under Route 410, there's 2 blocks of Carroll Avenue that could be turned over to the state, and the city would then receive $800,000 in cash, and it could repave Flower Avenue or do what we wanted to do to repave Flower Avenue, so that it would, and then it would no longer be a state highway. The work on Ethan Allen would then be done in the spring. Some of the discussion about that was that because the state highway wants to use federal stimulus funds to do the paving on Ethan Allen Avenue, they were nervous that having any kind of question about who owns it might be a problem with the way that the stimulus funds work. And so they were anxious to have that resolved as part of this discussion. One of the things that also, just as a factor, there's been a good amount of discussion, not with State Highway, but just in general, about if the current governor does not win re-election, does this proposal still stand? And I think that that's a question that we do need to think about in terms of timing. One of the things that I have been doing is talking with various folks about what we could ask State Highway to have as part of the kind of limitations on the agreement. And we don't have a decision on that yet. One of the things that I've provided at your place, there's some variety of materials. And on the back side is, on the second page of the white paper, is some language from the Maryland State Code related to the Transportation Division. Basically, the provisions of that are that a transfer of land for transportation purposes to the state is something that can happen, that the terms of the transfer should be that those that both the administration and the transferor agree to as reasonable and fair. However, Section 8303 does not create a condition precedent to or otherwise limit in any way the power to condemn property under this subtitle. In talking with folks who have worked with transferring state highway property and what all this means, as far as we can tell, it means, I think as Councilmember Clay had pointed out previously, the state can do what it wants. And we are at a position where whether we own the land or not, the state could take the land, they could use this, that's something that they absolutely have the power to do. In talking with,
Can you just clarify whether you're talking about the roadway that we own, or are you referring to adjacent properties?
I'm talking about the roadway that we own. Certainly, and with adjacent properties, but this particular provision is of publicly owned land, so it would be land underneath the road.
So they could just say it's ours and that's it?
Yeah. We don't have any legs by owning the land underneath us. We can have a discussion about it, but we don't have something that gives us an absolute override of these state provisions, of the state code. In talking with some of the lawyers who have worked with these kinds of transfers in the past, they said that the most useful thing is to have kind of language of intent as part of that agreement that make it clear, again, what the vision of the road is, identifying, the number of residences along the section, a variety of points as that, which would help give intent. One of the things that's important here is that the Tacoma Park Master Plan has language in it, criteria for these roadways that limits Philadelphia, Ethan Allen, and Carroll Avenues in Tacoma Park to 2 lanes and 50 or 55 feet wide right of and they suggest a 50 or 55-foot width right-of-way, which is very much what there is now. To have another lane would cause, you have to go through a master plan amendment, you'd have to go through a variety of steps in addition to the kind of things that you normally do working with a state highway. The other thing that I think is important to note is that the kinds of things that we would want to see along these roadways also are very consistent with smart growth provisions. Walkable communities, not huge divisions by roadways and that kind of thing. And I think that that kind of information can also be cited in some of the language. What I have done on this front page are kind of suggestions of text and things that we would try to get State Highway to agree to as part of these discussions. And what I'd like to be having in the next week are some discussions with some State Highway officials over these or other provisions that you might want me to go forward with. So this is just draft language, some draft suggestions, some draft items that they might agree to that would try to address the concerns that have been raised. The first 3 paragraphs are very much in the, that the City of Tacoma Park values the elements that make it a livable urban community, including compact development, trees and parks, pedestrian and bike-friendly neighborhoods, convenient bus and rail transit, and that kind of thing, citing the Tacoma Park Master Plan, citing the kinds of things that emphasize comfortable transit but not widening the number of lanes and not to look at through traffic as the determinant of the number of lanes and space in the right-of-way. Some of the provisions that I'd like to put forward to them to see what we can agree to, at least in terms of intent, is any kind of early notice. If there wasn't an interest in pursuing some kind of change in terms of the dimensions of the roadway and the right-of-way on both routes 410 and 195, which is Carroll Avenue. Close attention to the utility cuts, and I would love to get them to agree that if after the work is completed, the restoration work is not done to standard, that the city could undertake the restoration work and build state. Have crosswalks at Elm Avenue, I guess redo the crosswalks at Elm Avenue, and perhaps have embedded lights and appropriate signage. One of the things that has been a pet peeve of our planning office is that the standards for state highway signs, or signs along state highway in the right-of-way, have to be enormous. And it's just not appropriate when you're on a 2-lane road with close-in houses. And so something to adjust the standards so that they're not highway-level signs, but they're regular roadway legible signs would be something that we would ask for. And then just a reminder that we would want to work with them on any redesign of the Tacoma Junction area, and that redesign be appropriate to the historic area in scale and design, and again should be comfortable for pedestrians, bike riders, and mass transit users. What I'd like to do is to take this forward to discussions with State Highway and come up with a draft so that a resolution could come back to you by the last Monday in October or the first Monday in November before the elections. In conjunction with this, and I'd like to go one other place before we come back to your comments on this, so I've had a number of discussions about Flower Avenue. And the proposal is for the state to give us $800,000 to repave Flower Avenue. Now, once Flower Avenue is delisted as a state highway, then it really becomes, 3/4 or more Tacoma Park and 1/4 or less Montgomery County right-of-way. Any agreement that deals with that would need to be a 3-part agreement with Montgomery County because it's delisting the state highway for their land as well. The county does have the renovation or creation of a sidewalk on the eastern side of Flower Avenue in their CIP for FY 2016. That does give us some leverage to get some money or other assistance from Montgomery County as part of a redo of this street. What Darrell has suggested is that we really look at a green street design, low impact stormwater controls, good sidewalks and trees, and all of the kinds of things that make for a comfortable street. And what we don't know yet is, does $800,000 adequately pay for that? And so part of what we're trying to find out are a quick way to get some estimates about that, or if there's a gap, is that something that Montgomery County can make up or a grant could make up to make that work? The work on Flower Avenue doesn't have to happen right away, but we would need to agree to that as part of this exchange. The folks I have talked with a number of folks in the county, and they are open to a number of options. I've heard everything from contribution of in-kind services on coming up with a concept cost and a design and engineering work, to fronting us some money, or to kind of almost in a worst-case scenario, having the money that they would have used in the 2016 CIP paid to us in 2016 at that time, and that'd be firmly committed to. They've been helpful to work with so far, but, this is one of these, jump project on their desk kind of things, and so we're trying to get that moving quickly, and people are being accommodating, but it's been a lot of talking. I think that there's interested in making that work. If that, one of the agreements, my guess that they would want to see out of this is certainly if they fronted money or services now, they'd probably want to see us annex the full width of the right-of-way so that they don't have maintenance expenses in the future, and that would be part of their justification. So those are kind of pouring out the discussions that we've had. Got lots of details on environmental stuff, nice, good discussions. But what I would like from you is some direction as to what I should take back to State Highway, recognizing State Highway might not agree to any of this. Nevertheless, we'd be very persuasive. Some determination of what's most important here, or what, if there's something that just is something that would just end the deal, I'd need to know that. And, any other thoughts that you might have about how to move forward on this. So, yeah.
I'll start with two thoughts. One on the first bullet on the last page where it talks about the crosswalks installed at Elm.
Yes.
Is it worth saying the reinstallation of the crosswalks at Jackson?
It's fine.
Because I know the city, I believe the city put in the stop sign there and the crosswalk because we owned it. And I wouldn't want to not mention it and then have the state say, oh, well, those don't meet our criteria, those aren't going back in.
Fine.
So just kind of a, taking care of the status quo stop sign and sidewalk there. Because I think they work really well. Too bad we don't have more sidewalk on the other side to go to. And the other thing was, I wonder if we can at least try for any more specificity on the last bullet point with the new design for the junction segment, whether we can try and get them to agree to any more specificity, whether it might be potential timeframes or anything else that we can put there. I can imagine that they would push back on timeframes, not knowing what the budgets are, but are there any other details that we can put there that say, yes, we think, to get them to say, yes, we think this is a good idea, we can buy into doing something like that, we can't agree to specifics ahead of time, but we like the idea of trying to do something here, as opposed to just saying, no, it's fine, leave it alone.
I guess I would need direction as to what you would think is better, because I know different people have different opinions on that, and I wouldn't want to write something in there that then, that wasn't what you really
You
wanted.
wouldn't want to say, put a traffic circle in there and everybody goes crazy.
Right. I mean, and there's, obviously, there's different versions of that, but my sense of the discussion is that there's a lot of work yet to be done on a design.
I agree, and I guess therefore I'll say, is it worth putting in there that that a new design for that could proceed in a timely fashion by no later than FY13? Somebody can say, no, we can do it by 15, or whatever it might be, but at least we start somewhere and get them to say something. I'm not sure that it's something that I would say that particular aspect holds up an agreement, but I think we ought to at least try for something.
Okay. Sure. And I do see Councilmember Wright looking at the map that I provided. Let me just say what I've got on the map. Basically, I've shown the green line is Route 410, the blue line is Route 195, which is Carroll Avenue. The orange and yellow is Route 787, or Flower Avenue, between Carroll and Piney Branch. The areas that have the brown circles are those that are listed on the state highways inventory as being to be maintained by the city of Tacoma Park. As you see, it takes up most of Route 410 through the city. There are 2 blocks on Carroll. And then I have highlighted from the middle of Wilkinson Hall to Piney Branch Road the right-of-way between a curb, or what would have been a curb, and the property line is the area that's within unincorporated Montgomery County.
Councilmember Snipper.
Thank you, Mayor. Quick question on the Carroll Avenue piece.
Yes.
Just so the current border of Tacoma Park runs down the middle of the street?
No, it jogs. Sometimes it's closer to one side than the other.
You're kidding.
It's very difficult to determine where the line is.
So, because I take from the drawing that it does that, and that was my clarification.
That's about it, yeah.
That's about it. And will we, are we going to be on the hook for, any of this part? I mean, how does this work now? Because there's a little, for instance, there's that little side road now that they've put in.
Right, the side road,
the end.
the side road that is there kind of north of Ann Street up to Merrimack. It is part of the state highway right-of-way. The traditional understanding with state highway is like with sidewalks, municipalities end up maintaining those side roads.
Okay.
So we've been on the hook since they did that.
Just as we have with New Hampshire Avenue, with the side roads, the same thing.
That's correct. So the only issue here is that the 2 blocks that are between Carroll and just north of Glenside are listed as city maintenance. What I would want to do as part of this agreement is to incorporate all of 195 in the discussion that it's still maintained a 2-lane road, because I think that people would have the same concern elsewhere on Carroll Avenue through Tacoma Park as they would do in that 2-block segment.
I think you meant to say Garland and not Glenside.
Oh,
Yeah, you did mean Garland.
I did mean Garland, just north of Garland, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it is that the border there with Tacoma Park is very peculiar anyway. Then the other comment I wanted to make about Flower is that I've been trying for, I guess, almost as long as I've been on the council, and I know residents in the area have been trying for longer to get a sidewalk on the east side of Flower, because there are a lot of kids. I know people think that Tacoma Park children go to Tacoma Park schools, but a fair number go to Rolling Terrace from my ward. And unfortunately, that's a very important place for them to walk. And stretches of that are really hard to walk even for an adult. And it will not be easy because putting in sidewalk on that side will be a complicated business. There are some large trees which people will want to preserve. There's the road is windy and so on. And I trust Tacoma Park to do a good job with it, and I'm less sure about how the county would do it. And so far, they just keep they keep it on the CIP, but it just gets pushed out to every year it's a later year. And that was even before we had the financial crush. They just kept pushing the later year. So I'm very interested in proceeding with the swap as long as we can get State Highway to agree to the restrictions that you listed there concerning not allowing them to widen the street or add another lane or some similar crazy idea.
And I'll just go back real quick to say that I should have prefaced, excuse me, I should have prefaced my remarks by saying I like the information and the language that you've provided here, and I was only providing comments that build on that. Councilmember Robinson.
I also like the language and the direction you're going, and I support where you're headed. I am concerned about your comment about the election and whether that might kind of scotch the deal. And you said that you'd bring this back to us before the election. And in that time frame, are you expecting us to give you a go-ahead, even though we don't know which way the election's going to fall?
Yes.
And why is that?
I think that if this is the premise that we go forward on, that we would want to ensure that the current Secretary of Transportation is still holding her seat, that she would feel comfortable signing the agreement. I think we need to have direction to go forward with the agreement before
the election. Okay, thank you. That was a clarification. I have seen a paper that was called Maryland State Highway and Main Streets. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's something that I think we have access to, and I think staff has access to it, and it's a case study of how State Highway has interacted with Main Streets. And when they say Main Streets in this report, they're talking about the kind of Main Street we have along Carroll Avenue. So that gives me some hope that we could rely on at least some portion of State Highway to treat the junction and in particular, from my point of view, with some kind of respect. The signage, I think, is important, and I'm not ready to sign off on this unless you can get some sense that the signage is a negotiable item with them, because I don't want to get overrun either by wider streets, which doesn't look like a possibility. Very grateful about that, or signage, which could be really not good. So those are my points.
Councilmember Schultz.
I'd like to go back to the Tacoma Junction point, the last bullet on the second page. I'd point out that the Environmental Task Force report that we're just looking at takes great pains to talk about and devotes a good bit of language to the traffic situation at the Tacoma Junction, and makes many references to the need for what they call a roundabout at that junction. Now, I'm not here to endorse this comment's not to endorse that. Because we'll get to that in due course on a later session. But I personally happen to think that a roundabout option is something that needs to be optional and not foreclosed in this deal. I don't feel that the language that you've proposed here is direct enough. I think it's a little But I can understand that you're walking on eggs a little bit in trying to sort of sweet-talk the SHA into agreeing to something that we can later come back and say, well, you agreed to allow us to do X, or something of that nature. But the fact is that I think that the highway engineers at the state are going to be concerned about the flow of traffic, and that anything that the city might want to do should not impede the flow of traffic. And I think that that would be something we could say that we will not do. We would not propose anything that would impede or slow down. That, in fact, almost anything we would do, in reality, to Tacoma Junction would undoubtedly improve it, even if we did it with a blindfold on, because it's such a terrible mess at the present time and dysfunctional. And that would include the possibility of a roundabout and that sort of thing up there. But who knows what the new Tacoma Junction Task Force is going to come up with in their infinite wisdom. It may be something that's counter to what the Environmental Task Force came up with.
But Brett, which page in the Environmental Task Force are you looking at when you're talking about the junction and the...
Well, I was reading it this morning.
Which one? In an appendix?
No, it's not in the appendix.
68.
Let me just interject here that I'll give you congressional language. I would disagree with my esteemed colleague. I don't think we want...
Page 63, I'm sorry.
Well, thank you. That's the nicest thing you've ever said tonight so far.
I don't think we want to get that specific in here. I don't think we want to include language that says that we don't want to do anything that slows it down, because, in fact, we might want to do something that slows it down. We don't know. It could have unintended consequences, and I would just caution my colleague that talking about roundabouts will get you chewed up and spit out.
Yeah.
Well, you guys have got the historical perspective on the being chewed up and spit out on all this stuff that I lack. But I'd be interested to see what the Tacoma Junction Task Force comes up with in due time. I'm just saying, let's make sure the language doesn't keep us from all possible design options up there, and leave out the word roundabout. Okay? Even though I happen to think it's the greatest possible solution. But that's not an official statement. It's just a remark.
Don't hold you to it.
Right. So that's one thing, and I have some other comments, but I'll yield my turn right now.
Okay, Councilmember Wright.
Thank you. I completely agree with you, Mayor, on the language in that last bullet point. To me, it's not so much a question of being chewed up and spit out. I think most of us would be chewed up and spit out if it was really the right thing to do. But there is some history there where there was a request to have SHA engage in this, and I think that request got misinterpreted, and they looked only at roundabouts and not other options. So I think if we put roundabouts in there, that could be a signaling thing to SHA as well as other members of the community about what we want them to look at.
Okay.
So I had a couple of questions. One is, would the language in this agreement or letter be binding in any way? The state doesn't have to abide by it, is that correct?
Right, it would not be binding. What it does, though, is it does have an enormous effect, especially when it goes through the county process. Because what happens when state highways, when there's a proposal to change any state highways, it has to go through the county council's whole transportation process. And they look very closely at master plans, the county master plans, and they make pretty strong comments on those kinds of things. And they rank the priority of different state projects, and there's actually quite a lot of influence. This, although we would hope that it would be interpreted and understood and enacted by State Highway, used by State Highway, probably would have its deepest effect with the county council.
And why, it seemed like the first bullet point is kind of softer than what's described earlier on in the first paragraph, right? So
Yeah, I mean, you can,
Could we
I just
say-
threw stuff out.
Yeah, so,
Please change whatever you want. I'm
no,
just-
I was just thinking, in the sense that you very clearly say it would be very destructive to have a two-lane,
Right, well, this-
anything more than a two-lane road, right? So why not say that State Highway basically agrees they won't expand the road to anything more than a two-lane road? This sort of says, hey, give us notice if you're going to
Yeah,
pound a highway through the middle of our...
right. I think there's two different things here. The first is that this is actually a broader statement. So if all of a sudden they want to widen the right-of-way by 3 feet because that way they'll be able to accommodate bike lanes, or some other kind of bus stop situation or whatever, that we still need to be notified about that so that it's clear. I think there really is a very different thing when it comes to numbers of lanes. I don't think the State Highway will sign off on something that says they will not expand lanes, but I'm happy to try. I think that where it's more effective is in that more introductory language, but I'm happy to try whichever way I can push.
Yeah, I mean, I think it wouldn't, there's no harm in trying to say, have the bullet point in there that says basically they won't expand to anything beyond 2 lanes and see what the push is. And then I have some like practical, pragmatic questions related to Flower Avenue. I don't like the idea of the county giving us something to do, or us taking something from the county and then getting no ongoing revenue from it, for it. And so I just kind of want to, but I'm also very supportive to the pragmatic aspects of what happens in the community, and defer to Councilmember Snipper about what's best for his community. So if he says he really wants this, then I would agree with it, but I wanted to kind of pragmatically understand how it would work. So we would only be annexing basically the right-of-way portion, like, so the sidewalk, the half of the street,
Yeah, it's
whatever.
probably about 6 to 8 feet wide.
We wouldn't actually get to annex the properties that abut.
No, that's a whole different process. To annex properties takes a whole petition process, agreement by 25% of the registered voters and 25% of the owners of properties equaling 25% of the value of the properties.
So there'll be, everyone who is on that sidewalk then isn't in Tacoma Park, but the sidewalk is.
That's right.
So like, what happens when someone doesn't clear the snow on their sidewalk?
That's, the county has the same rule on that, but I mean, we've got that situation on Eastern Avenue. I mean, DC's got that situation where they own the sidewalk up to the people's houses too, so we have to, it's just the weird nature of our
No, it doesn't work
lines.
very well on Eastern Avenue
No.
either for the residents. Right, so,
No, but the county does have the same rule about clearing. It's going to be a little bit of an unusual situation, but I think it's workable.
and then also people would be advocating for improvements or things to their sidewalk that they wouldn't actually be paying taxes on. But those
I'm
residents-
assuming
yeah.
that they would, yeah.
Okay. And we could separately try and pursue that 25%, 25% of the
Absolutely.
value if we wanted to in the future.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's always open to us.
okay.
One of the things, Josh, about that from a practical point of view, I understand what you're saying and share your concern about that. From a pragmatic point of view of trying to make improvements on that roadway, you can envision, and in fact, Sabra Wong did a study for the State Highway about traffic calming on that section of Flower Avenue. You can envision a scenario where you'd need that right-of-way in order to enable either chicanes or alternate parking, or even complete sidewalk passage and crosswalks. So in some ways, actually restricting it to the curb line may make it more difficult to provide a accessible, pedestrian-friendly road as well as amenities, and having that additional right-of-way, even though it's, has the awkwardness of being.
Yeah, no, I have no doubt we
Granted
would get
by
a
the-
better, more cohesive approach to the roadway, without a doubt, and knowing the quality of work that you and your staff do, we'd end up with a better scenario on that stretch, right? It's just that question of like, we don't get any, it's kind of odd to have people abutting that are basically getting this service for the sidewalk and everything, but not paying not being part of Tacoma Park, so
One tiny opposite way we have that example in the city is the county recently installed a sidewalk on Ray Drive? That's one where the right-of-way is the county's, but the properties are the city's. So for trees on the right-of-way as well as sidewalks in the right-of-way, we don't do anything. We don't even maintain the roadway. But the people that live adjacent to that are right up against it, are city residents. So I think that's the only example. Boundary Avenue is one too, but there's no sidewalk there.
Right.
So
Ray Road or Ray Drive?
Ray Drive. It's right across from the middle school on Piney Branch.
Okay.
Yep, see you.
Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be real quick. I just think that we should try for the language on the number of lanes, for the more restrictive or more desired language, and we can always fall back to the other position. And then I just hope that the viewing audience is paying attention to this discussion. And I think that, the fear of what happens in this coming election, should Mr. O'Malley not win the governorship, is one little aspect of this discussion tonight. But it's something that I hope people will realize that the election is very important to all of us, and that they really do need to get out and vote, because there was some apathy shown during the primary, that if we have that same type of apathy during the regular election, we may end up with more problems such as we discussed tonight. Thank you.
Councilmember Robinson.
I had two small points. One was, with all this talk of annexation, Suzanne, I can't help but noting that there's a street in that section between Piney Branch and University, the kind of block which would make a perfect, the logical extension of Tacoma Park, that's Ludlow Street. And I wondered if that had anything to do with your...
You know, when I moved into the area, I saw that, and I drove over there, and there's a kind of a better section and a worse section. I happen to be on the worst section. But yes, I've noticed that in the past.
Okay.
I don't know where that came from.
Okay. The other small point I wanted to make was to Fred, to your Councilmember Schultz, to your thoughts about the traffic circle. And I was in the middle of that discussion about the traffic circle.
So you've got wounds.
Well, I was, I'm open to any discussion. I think that's important, to be open to any discussion. The plan that came back from State Highway had a pretty large traffic circle. And what they said also was, well, if you put one at the junction, you have to put one in front of the firehouse because of backup issues. But then there was some sort of pushback on that, because the firehouse said, well, we're not driving our trucks over any kind of over any kind of traffic circle. So there were some internal kind of inconsistencies in the planning and the execution and so forth. But the real balance that I've seen in all those discussions about Tacoma Junction so far, and as you say, we'll see a lot more when the task force comes back, the real balance was a feeling of small town or Main Street balanced against this feeling of let's get the traffic through as fast as we can. And the large circles and that sense of let's get the traffic through is at odds with what is at the junction right now, which is what a lot of people are working towards, which is to make it more pedestrian-friendly and so forth. And the concern was that because traffic circles do run a lot of traffic through an intersection, it would be harder for pedestrians to cross that roadway. So that was just for your information. That was, in my interpretation of the gist of the balance that was at issue in the intersection there. So I agree that traffic circles move a lot of traffic, but I certainly will not go so far as to say that that's the answer for the junction. Although I defer to my constituents largely, and to what the task force, with the junction task force, will come back with.
And just before I go to more colleagues for more comments, I'm just going to weigh in very briefly on the how the traffic circle request got going, just to try and clarify. just because I know it was unclear even when it was happening, and there was great angst in the community over what had transpired. My read on it was that the council was told by a number of people, including some pedestrian safety experts
Yes.
who were in town, that was worth considering. And when the council said, well, gee, does the state do traffic circles? The response from State Highway came back that, oh, we've just established a new division or a new special office that deals with traffic circles and has expertise in those. If you're interested in a traffic circle, the request should be directed to that particular office. They are the experts, they handle them. And staff forwarded the request for information for traffic circles to that office. That's why it was divorced from other options.
I see.
And we got the information back, and people took it as the city's asking for a traffic circle.
I see.
And in fact, we just said, okay, what's the information? Would one work? You all have the expertise. Tell us. So that's how we kind of got down that path.
Yeah.
Councilmember Wright.
A more articulate explanation of the request being misunderstood, as I think I could have stated. So I just wanted to, Councilmember Clay had some communication problems, but she did email me, and we know that she cares deeply about some issues related to this. So I just wanted to give voice to those issues. So one was that, was curious about the timing of when Ethan Allen would be repaved. So you're saying spring or summer?
It sounds like they are already looking at some of the kind of design of how to repave it so that it could be moving forward perhaps even as early as March.
Okay. Her desire is very much that it's at least in this fiscal year. So just wanted to put that out there. And then in here, we have that there's this process where if things were not repaired, we'd be able to bill SHA. Another option, I don't know if they would go for this, would be just to let us administer the permitting, the oversight of the permitting, which might, I don't know if Daryl thinks that's too burdensome.
I think she'd love to do that.
Or do you think that might be I don't want to call it an ad alternate, but a discussion point about whether they might be more open to that than us billing them.
Right. Yeah.
It would be advantageous for the city. Right now, when utility companies go before State Highway, they just get blanket permits to cover a massive number of time on Route, 410, without any specificity, whereas we require specifics and locations. So
I think maybe State Highway might be happier about that, because they probably don't want to do it because it's too administrative to do each one, right? But we could just deal with it, so maybe we could suggest that. And then the last one was to maybe go a little bit further than what we've suggested about Elm Avenue, which is, would there be a way for us to have the right to have more flexibility or right around the authority to control crosswalks and sidewalks, including installation, painting, enhanced signage, than just at that location? I mean, I know Councilmember Clay has been focused on that location. Others have had concern about that location, but there are other locations along 410 in the city that represent concern for people from a pedestrian standpoint.
Could they take out the stop sign at Jackson if they owned it? I'm sorry, I'm interjecting just on your point.
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, certainly they could do that. I was surprised they didn't already.
They didn't already, because they do own that.
No, we do.
We own it, right.
Yeah, but I mean, there's plenty of stuff that they don't allow and they take out because they say it's state highway and we didn't get a permit. So, one of these things where some things they've let slide and other things they haven't. This one they've
And
let
that was
slide.
my point earlier. Let's get that one.
I didn't mean to interrupt, Josh, I'm sorry.
No, so I think maybe that, just that, that, I guess it's the
Right, I'll pursue that.
bullet point just includes Bruce's thing about Jackson, but also maybe greater flexibility in putting in other crosswalks.
And before I go back to Councilmember Schultz, there was one other point on permitting that I wanted to tie into this. Daryl, do you have a sense that the issues with Washington Gas and ongoing, how that's going to happen, whether that's going to mesh with what we're talking about here with the possibility of March? What I'd hate to see is State Highway comes in and does Ethan Allen, and then Washington Gas comes and tears it all up.
Well, in our last meeting with Washington Gas, they indicated at that time that they were interested in starting the project yesterday. And, you know, we're raring to go, and as soon as the city provided the permit, they would mobilize, and they already had a contractor mobilized. But they've yet to complete the permit application, and that was several weeks ago. So they indicated at that time they were planning to do a fall installation of the high-pressure gas line. So I would still be under that assumption, without additional information from Washington Gas, that they'd be planning to move ahead in the fall and winter. So predate the March or spring timeframe.
So it sounds like if this goes forward, we need to impress upon them the fact that they really do need to get it done, because we're not going to, somebody's not going to let them just go in there and tear up that brand-new road.
Right, right. The design that Washington Gas has developed is largely based on boring underneath the street, so there'll be limited road cuts, but there will be some. They'll have to have access.
Yeah. Okay. Councilmember Schultz.
I just want to clarify. Susie, were you saying to us, in effect, that the election is really the important date, because I gather from what you're saying is that whatever's going to be done has to be sort of approved prior to the election, because the Secretary of Transportation would see herself in a lame duck role if Ehrlich became the governor, and therefore would not want to commit to anything after the election? Was that what you were saying?
That's what I was saying. I mean, obviously, if Governor O'Malley wins re-election, the presumption is that we'd still have the same Secretary of Transportation and that this agreement would go forward.
Yeah, that's...
But that's just if that doesn't happen, I don't know how comfortable she would feel going forward, or maybe she'd hurry and do it before she was moved on.
Right.
So.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted...
There's no guarantee.
But one of the things I'd like to mention here is that, while we might be talking about that in terms of taking advantage of getting the $800,000 and getting, some commitments to actually doing this work, which is important, in general, when we do these things, we have to look at the long term, which is that there is going to be changes in administrations over the years. And so the more that the language is clear about what the intention is and it makes sense for all the different parties, then the better it lasts. Because this isn't really to have effect over the next couple years. This really is to look at, 20 years from now and what happens then.
If I may continue?
Sorry.
No, that's fine. I appreciate your views on that, and I have to agree with them. In regard to a possible change in the governorship, I would just want to sort of build on what Councilman Siemens alluded to a minute ago with regard to what would happen if we get a different governor, and that is that he was quoted extensively in the Baltimore Sun last week as saying, former Governor Ehrlich saying that if he's elected, he's going to put a stop to the Purple Line and the Red Line that's at a similar stage in the city of Baltimore, because he feels that the bus route as opposed to light rail should be the preferred alternative. And as we know, when he was governor before, the planning for the Purple Line kind of was called a bi-county pathway. What?
Bi-county transitway.
Bi-county transitway, because he didn't like the idea of the image of a Purple Line. So for 4 years, things sort of stood still or went backwards. So there's no reason to doubt Governor Ehrlich's position on that. So again, I would, seeing as the sector plan up there at Tacoma Langley basically hinges on the concept of an improved economic base up there, thanks to the Purple Line. It would be a big setback in my ward, and I just want to make that clear to all those who are listening or going to be listening to this. But I'm sorry to go off on a tangent, but I just think it's something that people need to be aware of. I think that I support Councilman Snipper's point of view on Flower Avenue, and I think that in general, the language that we propose to the Secretary of Transportation needs to be as reasonably strong in our favor. And I say reasonably because we don't want to insult her or just be ridiculous about things. But still, if we don't ask, we're not going to get stuff. And maybe we should just go ahead and put language in there that we can back away from if it's necessary to seal a deal. But I think basically we're heading down the right path, and I'm just glad to see that the state is being willing to be more reasonable about this than they have been in the past. Thank you.
Susie, do you have the direction you need for pursuing, or do you need clarification on any particular points?
Yes, what I'm going to do is take your comments and modify my language a little bit. I'm hopeful to have a meeting later this week, with a key party at State Highway that I've been talking with to really feel it out more thoroughly. I'm actually out of town the following week, but I'll be trying to communicate and share back whatever kind of perhaps draft resolution with some language that you can look at, so that you have some time to discuss it and see if there's some extra tweaking that needs to be done.
But you've got what you need?
Yes, I do.
At this point. Okay. Thank you all for that discussion. I think that was very helpful and shows some real progress. Final item is council comments. I'll start off with 4 quick ones. I just wanted to mention that I appreciate Councilmember Schultz's efforts to pull together the orientation meet and greet at Tacoma Overlook last week. It was very interesting to go in that building. I was very impressed with the level of renovation in that building. That project looks to be really nice, and for those who haven't been over there, as I hadn't been, it looks quite different than its, I won't call it twin, but its partner building. And it was really interesting to get to meet the residents there. The city manager was there, the police chief was there, the city clerk was there, and provided a bunch of information about the city to them, and Councilmember Schultz pulled that together. It was a really good event. There was also another one that I was at, the Hillwood Manor Community Garden dedication, with great effort from residents, and I figured you might want to say something about that one, but
sure.
I was very impressed with that one as well this weekend. Upcoming events, this coming weekend, Sunday, October 16th, there's in the We Are Tacoma series, there's the Eureka Dance Festival with a master's dance class at 3 and a works in progress showing from 4 to 6, and that is here in this room. And then we have a tentative date of November 13th for the Ziegler Park dedication, and there will be more information on that. I think we're heading for the 13th. It may change to the 6th, but I think it's probably going to go on the 13th. And that will be at some time on that Saturday morning. Councilmember Robinson.
I want to say a couple things about Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. I liked seeing the plans last week about the Ed Wilhelm Field at Tacoma. What do they call it? Piney Branch?
Piney Branch Park.
Tacoma Piney Branch Park. Thank you. I always forget. I liked seeing the wetlands notion. Some of that stuff goes way back to something called the Green Team that I was involved with a long time ago.
Not so long.
Not so long, about 15 years or something. The day after that, the next morning, the signs that were advertising the chimney sweep as the sponsoring private entity for the Porta-Johns, those signs were removed. So I must have embarrassed somebody or something saying that there were signs up there, which there were, and they were taken down the next day. But my concern remains about maintenance long-term. They're going to spend $2.5 million up to $2.3 million on that park, but they can't guarantee that there'll be bathroom facilities. That concerns me, and I'm certainly not going to take MNCPTC to task about their planning, and I know that's important for us to get stuff on the ground, but I just want to express that concern. And the final thing about park and planning is that I asked, I think it was last week, about some kind of cost estimate for maintenance of Tacoma Urban Park, which is on Westmoreland, partly in Josh and your ward and partly in my ward. I don't know if you, my colleagues, are interested in supporting me on that request. The reason I'm requesting it is to see if it's a park that we might maintain ourselves. So that's why I'm asking for an estimate for the cost of maintaining Tacoma Urban Park over time. Just wanted to clarify that.
If I may, Councilmember Robinson, Darrell has already prepared that information. I just need to send it out, so I'll do so tomorrow.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councilmember Schultz.
I wanted to ask a question of the mayor. When is the time schedule for the ribbon cutting on the firehouse?
That is October 28th at 12. No, it's moved to 12:30. It keeps changing. October 28th at 12:30.
Oh, okay. Okay,
And I believe they're expecting at least 300 people.
Whoa.
Gee.
Be a tour inside, I guess, right?
I believe so.
The other comment that I wanted to make was what you were alluding to, Mr. Mayor, and that is the Hillwood Manor Garden dedication, which is, I think, it was worth mentioning, not so much because it's just in my ward, but because to me it represents an extraordinary example of volunteerism. You have a group of people who live in Hillwood Manor. For those of you who don't know where Hillwood Manor is, it's the little stub of Ward 6 that extends on the eastern side of New Hampshire Avenue along Erskine Avenue for about 4 blocks. There's about 80 homes in there, Elson Street, Elson Court, places in 13th Avenue, 13th Place, and 14th Avenue. Through the sheer energy of volunteers, starting about 3 years ago, they started an effort to build gardens in Hillwood Manor, and they've completed 2 of them. One of them is on the steep slope right off New Hampshire Avenue on Erskine Avenue. They did that with a lot of financial help from the city, also financial help from the Tacoma Foundation, and at least one other source that escapes me, plus an enormous amount of volunteer physical labor from all kinds of people in the area, including children. And the city helped build a wall, retaining wall, and among other things. And the other planting was on New Hampshire Avenue at the Hiker-Biker Trail as it goes across there. And that was done in conjunction with the Park and Planning Commission, who provided a lot of equipment, benches, help install a water pump, a fresh water pump, so that they would have a way of watering the garden. This is not a vegetable garden. This is just plants and trees of a great variety that are there in an area that's been beautified. They had to dig up a lot of asphalt that was underneath the turf that they didn't even know was there. And so it was a lot of back-breaking labor. It took them 3 years to carry this through. It is really lovely. I invite anybody to go over there and take a look at it, because I think it's just an astonishing example of what a bunch of people can do. This is not an organization. It's not a 501c anything. It's just a bunch of people who said, we want to do this, and they went around and they persuaded the sources of money to make grants, and they got it done, and it is significant. So my congratulations to them, and I hope it can be a model to all the neighborhoods in Tacoma Park.
And just let me add, in many ways, the nicest aspect of that whole project was what people said at the dedication ceremony, that they got to know a whole lot more of their neighbors a whole lot better, and it was a real community-building activity. Councilmember Wright?
Thank you. It sounds like a great community and neighborhood activity. I'm sorry I missed it, but hats off to all those people and their effort. It's amazing. So just a couple items related to North Tacoma. On October 19th at 7 p.m. at 7305 Baltimore Avenue, there's a neighborhood meeting with the chief, myself, and residents of the neighborhood to discuss a number of issues, including the parking situation over there. So I welcome anyone from North Tacoma to come and attend. I do want to say there's been a number of issues raised related to North Tacoma recently: parking, permits in the park, the sidewalk installation and tree issues. And I think, on many of those, we're working on thoughts and ideas for how to address some of those issues. None of them will be perfect, I'm sure. I think there'll be significant improvements. I'm not a proponent of individual residents deciding that they should put parking or traffic signs in the public right-of-way. I think that if we allowed every resident to do that at will, we would have a significant problem. I think that's the responsibility of the city. If there's a parking issue, there's things we can do to resolve it. And I understand that there may be a feeling that there's been a parking issue for a long time there, but the solution is not for individual residents to decide to put parking signs up in the public right-of-way for a variety of reasons. If we deem that it would be appropriate for the city to put parking signs up in those particular locations, that is a possibility. There are other solutions to that issue, but we also have to realize that parking solutions around that park are never going to be perfect. There's a set of trade-offs associated with it. People have asked for greater enforcement during the week because I think they've been frustrated around not being able to find a space, or not being able to, or having someone park in front of their driveway in the past. Obviously, those things are real concerns for people. But now we are basically in a state where the soccer league that plays there will basically need to shut down early if we don't come up with some other solution in the shorter term, because the number of families who were taking their kids there from 4 to 6 or 5 to 7, something like that, for soccer, the police did exactly what the residents wanted them to do. They started to enforce the resident parking permits much more strictly, and a large number of tickets were written. Close to 50 tickets were written to parents and of people who are residents of Tacoma Park, many of them wanting to use the park, not all of them, but many of them. So there's trade-offs related to that, and I hope that we can strike a balance. I know the mayor and I have been talking about this issue and figuring out ways to provide solutions that would improve the situation, but probably won't make it perfect for everybody. Thank you.
Anybody else? We're adjourned.